Hello, I've got 10 minutes to talk about how community currencies fit into the big picture. My book, The Memory Bank, which I wrote a few years ago, explores the possible relationship between the digital revolution in communications and the forms of money and exchange. And the premise is one which, of course, is a perennial one, which is how might this stage of the machine revolution help to serve the ends of economic democracy? This is an old question. It was addressed to the original factory system by Marx and Engels. It was addressed by various visionaries and social theorists to the world of electricity at the beginning of the 20th century, and is one which is very much alive with us today, as to whether this particular stage might be more suited than the others towards the advance of economic democracy. My fundamental insight, if you like, was that we have to identify this stage of the machine revolution in the way that we would most of the others, as a radical cheapening of a commodity. In the original industrial revolution, it was cotton textiles, let's say. The commodity in question now is the production and transfer of information. So the question that I asked was, how is the radical cheapening of the transfer of information likely to affect economic relations? And this leads directly to the question of what money traditionally has been. Money has been an impersonal instrument of exchange. This was so traditionally because people exchanging at distance, often without knowing each other, needed an instrument that could maintain its objective value independently of the people who used it. And as a result, many of us believe that money, the use of money in transactions, in exchanges, depersonalizes those relationships. And so we start from the assumption that money traditionally is an instrument of impersonal relations. One of the things that I became interested in was the way in which the cheapening of information transfers made it possible for personal information to be attached to long-distance transfers. It's manifested in many ways, but perhaps nowhere more obviously than in the field of personal credit, where there has been, in the last 20 or 30 years, a massive proliferation of new instruments tied to individual creditors. And there is an opportunity to attach a great deal of information about those persons and the conditions of their purchases and transactions also. Of course, this information can be most readily accumulated and manipulated by people with lots of money and power and with the ability to store vast amounts of information in ways that they control and we don't. And when I started out on this project, I had many people who said to me, but you know, this thing you're talking about favors the banks, the big corporations, the governments. It's a process that is going to lead to increasingly totalitarian societies rather than the opposite. And, but I still felt that it was worth exploring the democratic potential of this process, and it led me to the question of community currencies. I had met Michael Linton in Manchester in the early 90s. He was a Scottish engineer who went out to Vancouver Island and in a local economic depression invented one of the best known forms of community currency, known as LETS. And I've taken up a correspondence with him. And since I wrote my book, I have become associated with him. not really as an operator of one of these systems, but as a kind of fellow traveller, acquiring as much information as I could, and with a view to writing and disseminating information about them. And this leads me to the 2 points that I really want to make today in the short time I have, which is that if these new technologies are going to be translated into a higher level of economic democracy, then we have to devise new social forms that are better able than those we have. We had a very good example in the last session about how antiquated and obstructive the social forms we have of government in this country already. We have to discover new social forms that are better capable of organizing money and exchange than those we have. One of the problems, though, is that people who devise new social forms often do so by negation of the old forms. So, and they believe that they are engaged in a social revolution which involves abandoning the old forms and adopting new ones. And there are two problems with this. One is that the old forms are much more tenacious than we think. And the other is that it's very difficult to get people to sign up for a personality transplant or for some kind of program that promises to eliminate everything that they already knew before. I thought I'd illustrate the way in which the old forms persist by drawing your attention to the lime that you've been introduced to at this conference. The lime is in some sense new. It's a new name for sure. It takes the form of a script currency which is issued by a single agent, which is this organization in Limehouse TOWNHALL, and it circulates in some kind of parallel with the existing currency, the national currency, and it obviously adds all kinds of new possibilities. But in its social form, it is in fact extremely traditional. First of all, it's an impersonal currency. It's, that is to say, if you drop one of these things on the floor, whoever picks it up will be able to use it in the same way as you can. It's issued, it basically operates as a in a mimicry of a national central bank system. There is one issuer, and that single issuer is responsible for maintaining the supply, the scarcity or abundance of the supply. That single issuer is extremely vulnerable to anyone who wants to make a run on the lime or to invade it by forgery and various forms of criminal activity. I mean, this may sound humorous in a way, but I mean, it's what happened to one of the most exciting monetary experiments of the modern period in Argentina after the peso collapsed, and there was this massive and instantaneous growth of barter clubs, financed in many cases by a script currency similar to this called the credito. And for 3 years, people were engaged in it very fully, and it seemed like a genuine alternative. And then the gangs moved in, and the government and various other agencies undermined it so thoroughly in various ways that it lost its credibility, and the whole system of barter associated with it retreated to a very small level. So the first thing that I want to mention, and I have already outrun my 10 minutes, so I'll have to make it quick, is that when we try to devise new social forms, we should be very familiar with or aware of the importance of the nation-state form with which we're most familiar. Because the nation-state form is incredibly successful. It's a form of community that combines territory, political community, interest, symbolic or imagined community, and it's been dominant in our world for so long, and certainly within our lifetimes, that it's very hard for us to think outside that way of imagining how